Okay, it is time for the lab check, so make sure that you have completed all of the sections in your lab manual and that you thoroughly understand the material. This lab check has 15 questions and it is worth 20 points. Question number 1.
We are rooted in the cross, built up in Him who paid the cost. We are rooted in the truth. In faith we come to worship You.
I think it was nice of him to wait till we got dried off to give you guys hugs. It was exercise restraint, not hugging you. I just didn't want to be soaked the whole time up here, so I'll hug you later, brother. Chris, I can't thank you enough for sharing your story, because he's a living example of the message I'm going to share with you today. He's a living example of the scripture we're going to read where the Apostle Paul offers a similar testimony about God's power being made perfect in weakness. And let me just read the scripture for you. It's 2 Corinthians 12. 2 Corinthians 12, the second half of verse 7 through 10. So to keep me, this is the Apostle Paul, just side note, he wrote, a good bit of the New Testament, all right? And he'd done a lot for God and with God. And he's an impressive resume, and he writes this. So to keep me from becoming proud, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger from Satan to torment me and keep me from becoming proud. 3 different times I begged the Lord to take it away. Each time he said, "My grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness." So now I am glad to boast about my weakness so that the power of Christ can work through me. That's why I take pleasure in my weaknesses and in the insults, hardships, persecutions, and troubles that I suffer for Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So last Sunday, we talked about the test of suffering, and we talked about troubles and trials and challenges. And today, we're tackling a theme that there's certainly a lot of overlap in content, but I want to differentiate a little bit in that when we talked last week about suffering, our focus was a little bit more about the trials and troubles and things that make life hard from the outside in. And today we're going to hone in a little bit more, and sometimes it's hard to decipher the two, but we're looking at things that would be the thorns in our flesh that cause us pain and challenge more from the inside out. It's less about the person who did this to me and more about this thing that I struggle with in responding to the person who did this to me. It's less about things out there and more about, part of me that I describe as a weakness or a challenge. Now, Paul uses the language thorn in my flesh or thorn in my side. He's very vague. Does anybody know what the thorn in his flesh was? You could write a book, because even though it's very vague, it hasn't stopped biblical scholars from speculating, all right? And so they look at everything Paul's done, and they try to speculate, and there's speculation of what it might have been, everything from migraines to epilepsy to some sort of physical deformity to his temptation and wrestling with sexual desire. And the bottom line is we don't know what his thorn in the flesh was. It's possible he was vague in describing it because it was so obvious. So if you knew Paul, as the recipients of the letter did, and he said thorn in the flesh, you would know, it was this because he had a speech impediment, or it was this because he had this physical deformity. It's equally possible that he uses the vague language not to really reveal it, and so it's something that nobody was really clear about. Maybe his temptation or wrestling with sexual desire, or something else like that, right? So we don't know what it is, but we do know it caused him pain and torment. We do know it kept him from living the life he wanted to live without it, and doing the things he wanted to do without this constant challenge. And it says he begged. Other versions say he pleaded with God to take away this thorn in the flesh. And so I want to just kind of pause for a moment, and I want you to consider for yourself, what might be your thorn in the flesh? Please don't point at the person next to you. That's just will not go well for you, all right? Don't look across and go, oh, my teenage child, you're my thorn. No. But I want you to think about for a second, what might be something you would describe as a thorn in your flesh? And I'm working with this assumption. We're imperfect, broken people living in an imperfect, broken world. So we all have these things. All of us. Some of them, for us, are significant things that cause great pain and torment. Others, only by the grace of God, you might not be able to think of something that is that severe in your life. And only by the grace of God that might be true, but all of us, if it's not that very severe kind of thorn, we all have weaknesses. We all have stuff that we carry, baggage, pain, trials, whether it's our fear of rejection or failure or not being significant, or addictions that we struggle with. We all have insecurities. We all have those things that we can do a good job of ignoring them or hiding them or covering them up, but we have them. And if we walked in the room and everybody kind of was wearing a sign with your weakness or your thorn labeled, we'd probably all have several hanging around our necks, right? Because as much as we'd like to not talk about them or not put them out there, this is part of our humanity. It might be something physical, it might be relational, it might be your emotional health. We have them. So what would you maybe name as something that might be a thorn in your flesh? Something that might be a weakness that you wrestle with? If you're not sure what it is, we could just take our lead from Paul. He says that he begged and pleaded with God 3 times for him to take it away. So if you're not sure what your thorn might be, consider, what is it that you have repeatedly asked God to take away and remove from your life? That might be a good candidate for a thorn that we wrestle with. And while we're on that, let me just offer this. If you're able to name a weakness, a thorn in the flesh, something that causes you pain and torment, and you haven't asked the creator of the universe to remove it, then I'd recommend praying that prayer today. Because sometimes in God's grace and power, the things that cause us pain and torment, when we humble ourselves and we come before God, sometimes God chooses to remove that. That's why Paul prayed. That's why he prayed 3 times, right? And so start there. And if we get a similar answer to Paul, then we begin to kind of step into the rest of this passage. If it's not something that God says, okay, I'm removing that weakness, that pain, that thing that torments you, then we have to receive the rest of the good news in this passage, which is the response that God gives to Paul, which is, my grace is enough. It's sufficient. It's all you need. My power works best in weakness. So we just want to unpack that. We just want to hang out on that idea that God's power works best in our weakness. Now, as I'm preparing for this message and sharing with you, I realized that of all of the ideas that we find in the Bible, this might be one that would be a leading candidate for the most un-American. Right? We don't like weakness. We don't like anybody to know our weakness. I mean, this world functions like we want to believe, all of us, myself included, we'd like to believe that God's power is revealed best through our strengths. And that by God's grace, He's always removing our weaknesses and strengthening our strengths so that we can live our best lives, right? That's like plan A. Anybody want to sign up for that? Remove my weakness, bolster my strengths, live my best life. Sometimes God's grace works in that way, but more often than not, we all have these things that we have to wrestle with, that we have to deal with in our journey. And so much of the journey of growing in Christ is figuring out how do we trust in and follow a God who created the universe, but allows us to continue to walk with these weaknesses. And I just want to kind of open this up for us to consider today. What if we have a weakness, we have a thorn, we've asked God to take it away, God's not taking it away. What if we could trust the good news that weakness is actually God's gift for us to experience His power revealed in and through our lives? Would that shift our perspective? Would that set us free from fear and anxiety and resentment and bitterness? Would it allow us to live in the midst of our weakness with other broken, imperfect people in a way that our lives would testify and offer hope to others? I love that Chris stood up here and said he's 3 months, how long sober? 3 months, 6 days sober. How many of you know he's got a long way to go, right? He's not saying, there once was a day when I struggled with alcoholism. He's saying, like right now, in my weakness, God is doing something that I can't do on my own. This is a church that celebrates that kind of grace and power. Not a church that says, get your stuff together, figure out your junk, clean yourself up, and then come and we'll all have our stuff together on Sundays, and we'll celebrate all of our strengths. Right? Like, bring your imperfections. Bring your weakness, because here's the reality that Paul is declaring in this passage. When we're strong, we can forget our need for God. When we're strong, we're okay with optional time with Jesus. But when we are weak, how many of you could testify in the most difficult times of your life, when you were most aware of your weakness, is when you clung to God? Like a raft in the middle of the ocean in a storm, right? Those are the times that God's power is revealed in and through us in ways that change us, that display not how great we are, but display how great God is and how powerful God's grace is. That's the kind of community we long to be. And it's one of the reasons we celebrate stories of 3 months and 6 days sober. It's one of the reasons we celebrate, hey, guess what? There are people in our church going through divorce. There are people in our church struggling with mental health issues. We're normal. We're imperfect. We're experiencing God's grace in our weakness, not in our strength and our perfections. Chris mentioned my good friend Alyssa that shared several months ago. I think it was over the summer she was here. And she shared some of her story. And one of the things I love about Alyssa is she's not sharing what God did 5 years ago. She has a blog. We put the address in your message notes, This Thorn. Like, she has made this passage, in Paul's words, her mantra for life. Right? And she's a person, if you heard her share, incredibly educated, articulate, successful. She could easily fool everybody by only leading with her strengths. Easily. She could easily let you believe the false perception that she's got it all together. But she's chosen to say, no, I've got this thorn. I'm going to put it out there. I'm going to let people know of my weakness and see how God works in that. Listen to like a short little excerpt from her website. There it is. She writes this, and you can look at it there. I'm a 39-ish, I think that's a hilarious way to describe your age, just not quite to 40, but 39-ish year old married mother of 3 teenagers. My drinking didn't become abnormal till my early 30s. I knew for quite some time that I had a problem, but I was unwilling to consider I was an alcoholic. In 2 Corinthians 12, Paul shares about the thorn in his side. He begged the Lord to take it away, but God revealed the need for that thorn to keep Paul humble and dependent upon God for strength in enduring his weakness. I now know that my alcoholism is the thorn I've been given to grow in my faith and to continue to lean on God for support and strength in staying sober and living my best life. That living my best life caught my attention because she's come to recognize what Paul's saying, that her best life is not a life without thorns. Could we open ourselves up to that possibility today? That your best life is one where you learn to experience, to trust in God's grace in your weakness. Not to keep on praying and hoping that God will remove it, but to trust Him in the midst of our weakness. What if we became the kind of community that we could stop pretending like we don't have weaknesses? What if we became the kind of community where Chris's story got multiplied over and over again? What if we became more comfortable sharing our stories of God's faithfulness and goodness and power? Not, 20 years ago what God did, but right now, this week, when I was losing my mind about X, Y, or Z. Right now, when I lost my temper at work. Right now, as I'm navigating college choices with our oldest son. Right now, that we could experience God's grace and power. I'm increasingly convinced that God's power will be revealed in and through the people of Journey Community Church as we become more and more comfortable trusting God in our weakness, testifying to His power and grace at work in our weakness. It won't be, God's power will not be at work in unspeakable ways just because great preaching or great music or a new building. But because we are becoming a community of people that are bringing our whole selves before God and giving one another permission to do that and allowing God to do something new in and through us. I can tell you where I see God moving is where we're opening up to that. Where God is doing some of His best work. 2 weeks ago, and all of you were crying out there because Selena was sharing her story. That wasn't a story of strength, but weakness, and God's power was put on display, right? Where we're leaning into that. I see it where we're getting connected in journey groups. And in journey groups where you're face to face with, 3 to 6 other people that are figuring this out as we go. I see God's power working there, where we're acknowledging, I need some help. I can't do this on my own. I need a community of people who really know me to help me grow on the journey. What's it look like for us to continue to lean into being that kind of people, that kind of community? There's a new song out by Matthew West called Truth Be Told, and I thank Ryan Johnson for posting it on his Facebook page, because that song describes kind of the vision we have for what it means to be the people of God. I encourage you to listen to it sometime, but here's a few excerpts of the lyrics. I'm going to start before what you have in your notes. It starts line number 1, you're supposed to have it all together. And when they ask how you're doing, just smile and tell them, never better. Line number 2, Everybody's life is perfect except yours. So keep your messes and your wounds and your secrets safe with you behind closed doors. But truth be told, the truth is rarely told, no? I say I'm fine. Yeah, I'm fine. Oh, I'm fine. Hey, I'm fine, but I'm not. I'm broken. And when it's out of control, I say it's under control. But it's not, and you know it. I don't know why it's so hard to admit when being honest is the only way to fix it. There's no failure, no fall, there's no sin. You don't already know, so let the truth be told. There's a sign on the door says, "Come as you are," but I doubt it. Because if we lived like that was true, every Sunday morning pew or padded chair would be crowded. But didn't you say church should look more like a hospital, a safe place for the sick, the sinner, and the scarred, and the prodigals like me? Here's a couple of questions I want you to ponder. Some of you have a story to tell, to proclaim God's grace and power and faithfulness in your weakness. And I wonder how God might be inviting some of us to give thanks to Him, to give thanks as we connect with others, so that they know in their weakness they're not alone, because we've experienced the good news of what we're talking about. I also want to invite us to think about how is God inviting you to embrace your weakness as an opportunity to experience His power working in new ways. That could look a million different ways. But it'll mean responding in a way that demonstrates our faith. It might look like admitting your weakness to your spouse or to your kids. It might look like asking for forgiveness when you messed up. It might look like asking for help from a coworker. It might look like just stop trying to hide the things that are hard and say it out loud, knowing that there's other people walking through the same stuff. It might look like getting in a journey group where you can have close community to be fully known and fully loved and encouraged on your journey. I'll tell you one way it looks like for me right now. And so it looks like seeing a counselor. And so I shared last week that Jody and I went through some really hard years, and we went through a lot of intensive counseling just to stay married and not be a statistic. But now years later, I find myself in a place where I'm still discovering I got issues. And there are patterns of relating to people that hinder me from living life to the full and hinder me from loving well and leading well. And so I decided to start seeing a counselor again. And some of you think I am now unqualified to be your pastor. Listen, I'm just trusting that God's power is made perfect in my weakness. And as a side note, I'll just say this. I'm not sure there's anybody in the room that would not benefit from some occasional professional counseling. And if you're married, that doubles up the odds that you should be in counseling. Now, we're kind of laughing, but seriously, if you want to see God's power in your marriage, some of you, after you leave today, I'll give you a referral list of counselors, right? For couples, for individuals, like some of you, that would be stepping into your weakness instead of hoping that God's going to fix you or fix that person. And God's power works, not when we figure it out, but when we embrace our weakness, right? What's that look like for you? To recognize your weakness. If God isn't taking it away, if He's not answering that prayer, where's His invitation? To trust that His power is made perfect in your weakness. And then the last thing I feel like God's been encouraging me to offer to us today is how can you get more comfortable talking about your weakness so all of the other imperfect people that you live and work and do church around are more aware that they're not alone in their imperfections? How can we give one another permission? Now, I'm not suggesting that everybody should get up front and confess your deepest, darkest secret. That might make us a little dysfunctional, all right? But in a one-on-one situation over coffee or in your journey group or in a conversation with somebody that you trust, we could get beyond a surfacey kind of relationship where we talk about sports and the weather, and we could say, hey, man, I had a knockdown, drag-out fight with my kids last night. Or we could say, I'm miserable at my job and I'm not sure what to do. Or we could say, I didn't want to get out of bed this morning and I don't want to go back to a counselor. I don't want to be on medication again. I'm struggling. Will you pray for me? Right? We could say, our family photo looks a whole lot better than our family does if you kind of were a fly on the wall in the house, right? We could say those things. And we would move toward experiencing God's grace and power in new ways and shaping a community that is not about us, but about the power of Jesus being revealed. Do you understand? Like, to the extent that we hide our weakness and imperfections and the hard stuff, we keep God's power and grace kind of distant from us. But to the extent that we're willing to just be honest about who we are and the stuff we're carrying and the things, we invite God's power to change us, to transform us, to reveal God's glory in a way that God gets the credit. And people are drawn to Jesus and his power and his grace. I'm going to invite Jason and the team to come, and we're going to have a chance to worship as we close. And I want to invite you, I'm giving you a few questions to think about how you might respond. I want you to just kind of pay attention to where God's grabbing your attention today. And as we worship, there might be some ways you want to respond in worship that acknowledge our need, our weakness. Some of you, that might just be your posture. Like some of you might want to come here and just kneel at the front just to say, I need more of Jesus in my life. Some of you might want to just put your hands out. That'd be a new posture for you in worship, just to acknowledge, I need something from God that I don't have on my own. Some of you, it'd be really vulnerable just to put your hands up in the air and say, God, I want to experience more of you. Some of you might want to go to the back corner where our prayer team is available. You have any need, we'd love the opportunity just to agree with you in prayer, to invite God's power to be at work in your life. For some of you, like taking a step to ask for prayer is just admitting I need help. Others, you're going to need to just commit as you're worshiping. Your song will be pointless without committing to take a next step of some kind. So let's just allow space for that. If God's speaking, for you to respond. To say, God, I want to experience your power being revealed, made perfect in my weakness. You respond however you need to today. I invite you to stand if you'd like to. We're going to worship.